Next up is the AECOM panel. AECOM is a global professional services firm providing integrated design, planning, economics, architecture, engineering, environment, construction, and program management. The economic practices at AECOM provide market analysis, financial feasibility studies, and development and operational consulting on projects in the themed entertainment industry as well as other industries. This panel includes this morning Mr. John Robinett, who is the THEA 2016 Distinguished Service Award honoree. Yay, John, yay! Next is Linda Cheu, who will focus on the museums. Margreet Papamichael is focusing on Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and Brian Sands on the Americas. I do want to mention that the themed index, which I mentioned in the intro earlier, is available outside on a table, so each of you are welcome to pick one up and take it with you. All right?
Joe. Reporting live from Disneyland, California. This is John Robinett.
And Linda Cheu.
And this is World Attraction News.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have a very interesting segment planned for you today on World Attraction News. As most of you know, this is a very big year for the TEA and AECOM, as this is the 10-year anniversary of the themed index. Yay! So, John, to kick us off, can you talk about what's happened in these 10 years, sort of do a retrospective? I understand from my sources that you've been preparing some very interesting comparisons of the theme index to some other industries and leading economic indicators.
That's right, Linda. Why don't we take a look at those? Okay, so I thought since we've been doing this for 10 years, it'd be interesting to look at some of the other indices that are out there in the business world and compare those to the theme index and see how we do. So here you have the S&P 500 stock index. And as you can see, it wobbles around up and down quite a lot. This is from 2005 to 2015, which is the last data that we have for the index. And you can see up and down and, into 2015 heading down in terms of percentage. But the theme index just steadily grows and maintains a nice, steady, moderate growth. So that's one. The ISM Manufacturing Index, index of manufacturing activity. As you can see, it really wobbles around a lot here. But the theme index is steadying up, and the manufacturing index has been heading down. A very important index that we need to take a look at here next, thank you, is the men's underwear index. Now that's a consumer staple product, and so typically it's pretty steady. But when times are rough, guys have to stretch it out a bit, and you can see here that it's heading down, and the theme index is heading up. And finally, the most important one, the diaper rash index. Now, during tough times, parents will increase the interlude between diaper applications, and therefore diaper rash goes up. So this index is actually up, which is bad, but the theme index is up, which is good. So, Linda, I'd have to say in conclusion that looking at these very important economic indicators, that the theme index over the last 10 years really rocks.
Well, okay then. That's not exactly what I expected, John. Aside from diapers and underwear, can you give us any real economic indicators, things that maybe our viewing audience actually cares about?
Well, I suppose so. Okay, here we go. Let's look at some other things. So we've looked at the theme index using the top 25 parks. And if you remember over the last several years, I know a lot of you attend these every year, we talked about how global demand for our attractions is increasing as middle-class incomes rise, particularly in the developing countries. So we focused sort of on the demand side. This year, I thought it'd be great if we focus on the supply side. Let's see what's happened with the attractions over the last 10 years. Where's the geographic distribution? What's happening with the operators and all of that? So I'm going to just run through a few quick slides for you on that and see what they tell us. So here you can see global GDP, gross domestic product, which is probably one of the major measures of economic activity, and it's heading up at a quick rate, then the recession, and then stabilized. And you can see that the theme index is running fairly parallel to it, particularly at the end. If we look at the percentage change, which we can hopefully look at here, there it goes. The percentage change on the right there, you can see the theme index, again, is fairly steady, whereas the GDP percentage change just goes all over the place. So when you look at these together, particularly in the last years, we did a multiple regression analysis that shows the relationship between different factors, and there's a pretty high correlation between global GDP and the theme index. Next, we took a look at disposable income. We did this in the US because we've got numbers for that. If you look at the theme index in the US, the main parks, versus US disposable income, look at that fit there. The lines are almost identical, and if we run the multiple regression analysis, it shows that the correlation between those two is very high. So that should make us have more confidence as an industry that as income increases in the developing countries and the emerging markets, so will the attendance of attractions in our business. The two are integrally linked. And so from the supply side, it's sort of proving the demand side, if you will, that we should see increased demand as global incomes increase. We also looked at entertainment spending to see if there was any relationship between entertainment spending and our attraction business. And you can see there really isn't. And I think that's because the Fed number crunchers have a cat's breakfast of things they throw into entertainment spending, pet food and toys and all sorts of things. So that one didn't turn out to be very relevant. So another thing we wanted to do is industries look at, like retail looks at same-store sales. So they'll look at all of their stores, like the Gap, let's say, that they had before they added all the new ones to see, well, how are our existing stores doing, not taking into account the addition of the new ones. So we did the same thing for the theme attraction industry. And you can see the green line is the same park sales, if you will. And you can see it's growing at a pretty good rate. But when you take all the parks, which includes the new parks that have been built during the last 10 years, you can see the rate's much higher. So the overall business is growing at about 3% a year, roughly. And if you take out the parks that were built in that 10-year period, it drops it to about 2%. So the new park building, the new investment that the operators are putting in by building new attractions is supporting the growth by about 1% per year, which we thought was kind of interesting.
John, I have a question.
Yeah.
How have these trends differed by geographic location? Is the distribution different depending on where you are?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's take a look at that. I have a slide on that. So this is the geographic distribution of our attraction business back in 2005. And you can see North America dominates at 54%. Europe's about 13%, and Asia's 33%. There's quite a change in the last 10 years, a substantial change, no surprise, but you can see the pivot to Asia. Asia's 40% now in 2015. North America's 47%, and Europe's about the same. So what we're seeing is a major shift of business volume to Asia. We think by about 2020, say, the two will probably be even. Chris Yoshii from our Asian office thinks Asia will surpass North America, but we're a little not quite as optimistic as him. So let's look at income versus the attraction business. Here we show attendance Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is attendance per capita, excuse me. So if you add up all the attraction business in these different geographic areas and divide by the number of people, you get the per capita attendance per geographic area. So what you can see is North America is at about 0.45 attendees per capita, is very strong, particularly when you compare it to Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Asia. So what this tells us is that there's a lot of upside for these other geographies to grow as their middle class income grows, to grow up towards what North America is. So we feel this is a reason for optimism. This is sort of a large upside here in the Americas compared to the other major geographies around the world. So again, another sign to be excited about our industry and the future. So just a few more here. Everyone always wants to know what Universal and Disney and all the operators are doing. So what we thought we would do is, let's look at the market share each of the major operators have in 2005 versus 2015. How has it changed? Now you would think that with all the emerging operators, Merlin in Europe, OTC in Asia, and all the others, that Disney and Universal's share would probably shrink a little bit of the market. So make a note, 54% Disney, 13% Universal. And in 2015, 58% Disney, 15% Universal. So despite the growth of a lot of these other operators and emerging operators that are consolidating the business all over the world, Disney and Universal still managed to increase their market share. So the stars are still doing quite well. And I have to say that that's not without, of course, a lot of investment over the years in new attractions and new parks. So they've put a lot of money to increase their market share, but they, in fact, have done it. So that's the quick overview, Linda, of all the major stats for the last 10 years.
Great. Thank you, John. Now, let's move on to how these trends play out around the world, really on the ground. And as we've been doing our research this past spring in the theme index, we have some interesting trends to share with you. I'd like to turn my attention here to a very, very special guest, straight from London, Margreet Papamichael, the director of AECOM's Leisure and Culture Practice in Europe. And Margreet, I understand that you just flew in from London yesterday. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. We have some good news in Europe, and I'm delighted to share that with you all. There are some different things coming out of the index this year. There's some ups, there's some downs, there's also some bits and bobs.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about some of the good news?
Yeah, I can share some of the good news. The one good news, you just saw it in John's numbers as well. The Disneyland numbers are up again this year, which is great because last year they were down and that all had us a little bit worried. But this year they're up again, and that's fabulous news. That's put down to the investment in some existing rides, but also very much the Frozen show that they've put on that. And the Star Wars Academy that they've started, which has been a huge success. Their revenues are up, and I put that down to the fact that I took my family of 4 there that summer. Let's see if I can do that same trick. John, you might have to do this. Oh, here we go. There's more good news, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Europa Park. I don't know if you've heard about Europa Park at all, but this is a park in Germany, and it celebrated its 40th birthday last year, and that's really done the world of good to their numbers. They were up again, and these guys just go from strength to strength. It's amazing. They've extended their shoulder seasons. They've extended the length of stay again. It's a family-owned park. There's continuous investment happening, and as far as I'm concerned,
2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up.
Now, Margreet, is it all good news in Europe?
No, it's not all good news. That'd be lovely, wouldn't it?
Would be lovely.
Yes. No, I'm afraid that there has been a spot of poor news, let's put it that way. But there's been a terrible accident early June in Alton Towers, one of the UK parks that's owned by Merlin. It was all over the news, so it's no use not talking about it. The park closed. It was quite a dramatic accident with one of their coasters. The park closed for a while as Merlin obviously did the logical thing and went into complete overdrive on the security side of things and checked every single cog and wheel that there was of all their existing rides. Now that's had an impact on Alton Towers, obviously, but also their sister park, Thor Park, also was impacted by that, and those visitor numbers are down a tad because of that. Having said that, you would then expect Merlin as a whole to perform poorly this year, but they've done really well in the sense they've opened 7 additional midway attractions. And that, for me, is quite important. What we see a lot of at the moment in Europe and also in the Middle East is the development of family entertainment centers. And their midway attractions pretty much fall within that target. They're smaller type of attractions aimed at a family market. And those are doing a lot of good for Merlin. So that really has made sure that their overall numbers aren't too poorly impacted by the nasty accident that's happened.
Margreet, when you review the data from this year's research effort, are there any surprises?
Well, I don't know whether they're surprises, but there are a couple of things in there that I really like. So I'm desperately trying to get this to work. There you go. Puy du Fou, a TEA award winner this year, and deservedly so. Thumbs up.
Another 2 thumbs up.
Definitely. Don't know how many of you have been there or are familiar with this park. It's a show-based park. It's got seasonal openings. It's open air. And it puts on a number of historically based shows. And as a visitor, you go from one show to the next show to the next show. It's an awesome phenomenon. And it's gone from strength to strength in these years. And I did a quick calculation. I couldn't do that for 10 years for them. But I did a quick 5-year calculation on that. And they've grown by 8% every year on year, once you calculate that. And as far as I'm concerned, what better proof of a success story there is? It's going to be hard to copy that one, although many people are trying and are looking at it. There's another one that I quite like that's happened this year. I had a bit of a discussion with the people who run Parque Borne and Parque Beach. Their numbers are really good as well. Clearly, there's been a bit of strengthening in the Spanish economy that's helped that. But interestingly enough, and Ryan, you'll appreciate this too, they put a large amount of the growth in their visitor numbers down to the opening of their water park. Now, their water park was opened mid-2014, and 2015 was their first full year of opening. And they're saying that the water park has created what is now a multiple-day destination, and that in turn has increased the numbers of visitors to their main park. So as far as I'm concerned, it's another one.
Wonderful. John, I'm just getting word that we have Chris Yoshii live from our Hong Kong bureau, ready to talk to us about the themed index results in Asia.
Well, that's fantastic. Oh, Chris? Can you tell me what the latest trends are we're seeing in Asia?
As we all know, Asia is rapidly evolving, and we seem to be transitioning from a frothy, speculative mess to more realistic, let's roll up the sleeves mentality. So the speculative talk is dying down in favor of projects with a real understanding of the complexity of the projects. Some of the trends we see are, first, the big parks are getting real. We're all looking forward to Disney opening this year, and Universal Beijing has its groundbreaking ceremony in November. The second, the foreign invasion continues. 26th Century Fox starts their construction in Malaysia, Six Flags announces a strategic deal in China, and Lionsgate has their indoor attraction in Zhuhai. Third, local themes are thriving. There's a definite trend to incorporate and develop local themes and stories in movies. A great example is the hottest blockbuster movie in China is not Star Wars. It's Mermaid, a Hong Kong production. By the way, February, the total box office in China was higher than the US for the first time ever. It's inevitable that China will exceed the US in box office in the next few years. Fourth, it's urban indoor. There's a huge amount of malls opening and they need attractions. They need something better than kiddie ball pits. Fifth, water everywhere. There are dozens of water parks under development in Asia, and China is really leading the pack. And last, it's weird and wonderful. The theme parks are a very loosely described term in Asia, and we see all sorts of weird and wonderful attractions, from military experiences, disaster parks, and even fake religious temples, and on and on.
Hey, Chris, we know that Shanghai Disney is opening the 16th of June. What are the expectations, and what are they doing differently there?
Expectations are high, and probably higher within the organization than outside. They recently announced having 6 themed lands and a number of first-ever attractions. Sleeping Beauty Castle will be the largest in the world. They also announced a tiered pricing system which charges significantly more on weekends and holidays. Their peak price is more than double other theme parks in Shanghai and well above the current price leader in China. And what's really surprising is the peak day price in Shanghai Disney is higher than Tokyo Disneyland. While this is partially an exchange rate phenomenon, nonetheless, it's amazing. So people will be judging Disney, is it really worth the price? We also look for Disney to offer world-class service and experiences, and given the crowds they're anticipating, that's a real challenge for anyone. But fundamentally, we see Disney raising the bar on quality, excellence, and fun. And that's good for everyone to aspire to.
So Chris, what are the initial results from the theme index work this year?
The results for 2015 are mixed, with some areas showing growth and others softness. Japan had a huge run-up in attendance the last few years, with blockbuster openings and park-wide celebrations. So 2015 overall was probably flat. Korea also is similarly flat. Hong Kong actually saw a drop in attendance, primarily from a drop in tourism from mainland China. China had some outstanding performances from the likes of Chimelong Group, and particularly their Ocean Kingdom theme park in Zhuhai. Ocean Kingdom won the Thea Award in 2014, and the market really responded. They also added 2 mega hotels, so they will definitely be moving up in the ranks. Southeast Asia generally saw a modest increase as their economies continued to grow. So all in all, we think there was an overall uptick in the numbers, but it's a mixed story.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure the Chinese economy dropping has concerned some people about what that means for our business. What are your thoughts on this?
Despite the news of a dramatic slowdown in China and other countries, it's really about economic transformation. China is transitioning from a smokestack to a service economy. Last year, services industry became the dominant sector, and there's no turning back. The amount of spending on culture, tourism, entertainment, and education is booming. Local governments are more than ever willing to give preferential treatment to commercial, entertainment, and cultural projects. This is TEA's sweet spot. In an odd sort of way, this slowdown is really a boom for TEA companies.
Right. We know that we've all been busy in China, Chris. As that market matures, which other markets are you looking at for growth?
China tends to overshadow the rest of Asia, particularly in the Western media. Southeast Asia is quietly becoming a hotbed for new themed attractions, resorts, and cultural experiences. Unlike China, these countries have large, youthful markets. Domestic and international tourism is booming, and people are looking for what to do. Developers are responding. In Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and even Vietnam is getting into the game. India is still bubbling away, and we all know eventually it will be a huge market. Korea is posed for some big projects. Something is going to happen there. The challenge in Southeast Asia and India is budgets. They're not nearly as high as China, and certainly not in the West. So TE members need to adjust their approach to these markets. All in all, these are exciting times in Asia, and TEA is getting stronger than ever and leading the way.
Well, thank you for an upbeat report. Chris? Linda?
Seems like somewhat of a low-budget effort on our part here.
Speaking of low budgets.
Yes. What a treat to have Chris Yoshii join us. Now let's move a little bit closer to home and talk with the Americas, about the Americas with Brian Sands. Brian, what trends are we seeing overall?
Well, Linda, we all know that the North American market is quite mature and well developed, but there's still some interesting trends that are starting here and that we expect to see roll out across the globe. Before getting into those, though, I'd like to just briefly touch on some of the top-line results for the major operators in the domestic market. And, oh, there we go. All right. So, it was a good year for many of the operators. To start with, we estimate that the park segment at Disney had revenue growth of about 10% domestically and accounted for over half of the revenue growth at the top operators. We also estimate that revenue growth at Universal's domestic parks increased by about 20%. Very strong growth. And the remaining operators generally did well also.
Brian, what is driving the industry's revenue increases in the Americas?
Well, it's a combination of factors. The first is that attendance was generally up at the parks. And we'll be detailing those estimated attendance increases at individual parks later this year with the theme index. But it's worth noting that Disney reported its domestic parks attendance grew by a remarkable 7% last year, accounting for about 40% of the estimated total increase at domestic parks, driven by such factors as the continued success of their major films, as well as tie-ins to its parks and associated investments. Universal, of course, doesn't report its attendance, but we estimate that it grew by around 9% or so domestically, driven primarily, again, by continued growth at Diagon Alley and Hogwarts Express in Orlando, as well as investments closer to home here in Hollywood. Six Flags reported an 11% increase in attendance, likely the result of opening a number of new rides. The effect of combined revenue and attendance growth was generally positive. When we move over to per caps, with both Disney and particularly Universal experiencing very good estimated per capita revenue growth, which is great for the industry.
Now, John presented some global metrics, trying to compare how sort of the themed index has done against other kinds of indices. Is that still true here in North America?
Yeah, it is. The domestic attendance grew quite strongly when we did per capita revenue growth. It's about 3%. The S&P 500 grew by about 2%. Actually declined last year, and GDP grew by about 2%. So we're continuing to see growth in the industry. So Linda, I know it's pretty amazing that our industry is growing so strongly, and you have to kind of wonder what is allowing our industry to grow like this year after year. And there's a lot of factors. We talk about this frequently, and you can see a lot of those factors up there. We're all quite familiar with them, and I know we as an industry concentrate on getting these things right. But I think really one of the biggest changes that's going on is that we're seeing two factors that are bringing all of these things together. And those two factors are technology and integration in a way that we haven't seen historically. Next slide, please. And let me just talk about a little bit of how that's happening and how that's being done as an example. Next slide, please. The most recent example, and probably the biggest one that we're all aware of, is Star Wars, where there's obviously tremendous pre-marketing for the movie that was released last December. But just as important to that was the much earlier pre-marketing that occurred in release of associated toys, video games, and other merchandise. This started early in September. Some of you may remember that there was a reveal of the toys associated with the new movies that was actually done live via YouTube globally at 15 locations progressively across the globe. Really generated a lot of buzz for the movie. Then after that, in October, there was the release of the Disney Infinity 3.0 characters. So you actually got to see the characters for the movie that were able to be used actually in Disney's sort of toy box open world video game environment. And then Star Wars Battlefront was released as well, a first-person shooter game in November. All of this, again, was prior to the release of the movie and really built things up. And the movie itself has obviously done very well. For those of you who were looking at the headlines over the weekend, global revenues surpassed over $2 billion, which is pretty amazing since December. All this is played straight into Disney's activities at its parks. And if we go to the next slide, please. The Star Wars Launch Bay attraction was opened in mid-November here and opened then shortly thereafter in Orlando. That's adding to existing Star Wars attractions at the parks, such as the very popular Jedi Training Academy. I know Margreet and Linda, both of you, have been there with your kids, and I know
we were successful. She wasn't.
You got it.
Okay.
We never managed. It was too busy.
Okay. Well, I know it's a very, very popular attraction. In addition to that, there are some new things in the pipeline, obviously. Next slide, please. Star Wars: A Galactic Spectacular is going to be opening relatively soon, which will have a combination of Star Wars themed fireworks, lasers, light projections, and other special effects, together with music and iconic characters and scenes from the shows, and then apparently as well, potentially the use of drones for the first time as well, which will be pretty remarkable. And then, of course, beyond that, next slide, please, is the opening of the current under development Star Wars lands, both here and in Orlando, which at about 14 acres each will be the largest new lands in Disney's history. And in addition to that, they're really going to be using a lot of innovative technology. Apparently, that will include a virtual reality experience of being on the Millennium Falcon. Should be very exciting.
Where else are we seeing the impact of technology?
Good question. So most immediately, the most visible effect is actually in-ride technology. So expanding on what's going to happen with the Millennium Falcon, we're actually seeing rides integrating virtual reality now. Next slide, please. In 2015, we saw Iron Reef just up the road here as introduced, and Justice League Battle for Metropolis introduced. This year, we're seeing some additional rides that are actually a couple have just opened up, apparently, integrating virtual reality. One is the Plants vs. Zombies at Carowinds, something which, because I'm on the East Coast, I look forward to going to experience. And then Six Flags is apparently using technology together from Samsung and Oculus to create a series of virtual reality coasters across the country. The first of which opened last weekend at Magic Mountain. I'm actually going to try and catch while I'm out here after the summit, maybe before the gala. In addition to that, The Void, a standalone attraction which is offering a virtual reality environment in which to play an immersive first-person shooter game, is opening and actually has very strong plans to roll out globally. There are also a lot of other ingenious new attractions in the works that we're seeing that integrate the immersiveness of VR in order to create environments and places that people really can't otherwise experience, like outer space or an ancient civilization or the deep sea. And those are going to be some exciting things. Both this year and in the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of those.
So Ryan, earlier, I just want to go back to something you had said about one of the success factors really being about the integration of different land uses. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, next slide, please. Actually, outside of the gate, many of the parks are stepping up their game in the level of integration and immersiveness and the quality of offering, both in terms of lodging and retail dining entertainment. Last year, Cedar Fair improved the lodging at the Breakers, and Disney renovated and expanded the Polynesian Resort, as well as a stepwise opening of the new Disney Springs. Nearby, the Legoland Hotel opened at Legoland, Florida, and soon the Sapphire Falls Resort will open at Universal. The potential for additional revenues from, particularly on the resort side, also the retail dining entertainment side, has not gone unnoticed. SeaWorld recently announced the development of a resort development group, and they've outlined a resort strategy that could include the development of lodging at multiple parks, which would be very exciting. Merlin is also planning to expand its lodging offering, both at Legoland, California, where they're going to add a second hotel, apparently, and at Legoland, Florida, where they're going to introduce a new product, it appears, bungalows.
There's a lot going on in the Americas, Brian. Wow. You know, I know you know a lot about water parks, too, and you're a personal fan. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. Water parks is definitely a market where Chris mentioned that in Asia, water parks. I think we're also seeing a lot of growth here domestically. We had the opening of 2 major indoor water park resorts in the Poconos, Aquatopia at Camelback Resort and the Kalahari Resort, both of which have major lodging, convention, water park, and retail dining entertainment components. There are other indoor water park openings, including the Great Wolf Lodge just down the road here in Garden Grove. And they've also reportedly purchased a 50-acre site near Disneyland, near Disney World, and are expected to open a resort there fairly soon as well. In another example of remarkable technology, it also appears that courtesy of the Kelly Slater Wave Company and the Inland Surf Company will soon have the ability to separate high-quality surfing from the ocean. I don't know how you feel about that, John. I know you're a very avid surfer.
I think it's good, and all the inlanders can stay inland, and the guys that live near the coast can have our waves.
Very good, very good. Well, I think it offers definitely exciting opportunities for surfers who live away from the ocean, but I think also for resort operators, this is going to be a space to watch. I suspect that we will see the combination of these kind of high-quality wave parks together with resorts in some unexpected locations.
So Brian, you're very, very optimistic about just about everything, it sounds like. Last year, when we talked about Latin America, there were a few bright spots, but there was, frankly, a lot of doom and gloom. How's it looking this year?
Yeah, unfortunately, south of the border, things are remaining very challenging still. It's still a difficult market, as we all know. GDP declined last year, actually went negative in Brazil. There's clearly a lot of political, economic crisis going on in that market, particularly in some of the other markets as well. That's causing sort of a similar effect that we saw here in the U.S. during the Great Recession, where we saw actually people staying closer to home. So there's a lot more sort of internal to the markets activity that's occurring, a lot less outbound international traffic. The good news for us in the States is actually right now the currency conversion rates are really amazing. If any of you are interested or wanted to spend some time in Latin America, now is definitely the time to do it. There are also some good things happening. We have the Rio Olympics coming up in a couple of months. It's very exciting. Despite the Zika scare, hopefully that's going to throw a good light on Brazil and some of the other countries in the region as well. There are also some smaller park additions and expansions going on. Six Flags has announced that they're going in, taking over a park, a government-owned park south of Mexico City, so that's great. And I think really the biggest regional news is fairly recent. It's sort of been a long time in coming, but fairly recent, and that's the slow but sure opening of the Cuban market. Cuba is so proximate to the U.S., I think that it offers a tremendous amount of opportunity and of growth to occur. It's got authenticity, it's got history, it's got nostalgia, it's got tremendous beaches, and it certainly needs a lot of work, which is a good opportunity for us. And we've seen already some progress. Starwood's going in. We've seen the allowance now of direct service flights over to Havana are going to start soon. So I think that's a space to watch as well. So overall, I would say, there's a lot going on in the Americas, and it's an exciting time.
Thanks, Brian. Never a dull moment in the Americas. Linda, since you're here and you follow the cultural part of the theme index, can you tell us what's happening with museums?
Well, let me tell you, the last decade has been really interesting for museums, certainly a period of change and transition. I think museums are really trying to figure out what they're going to be, what they're going to grow up to be in the future. What is the museum of the future? Similar to many industries, museums have seen so much rapid change in the last decade around them. And they're really trying to figure out, how they respond to that change without compromising their missions. And there's been a lot of tensions, frankly, around that. But ultimately, they're all trying to figure out how are they going to continue to drive attendance and what is it going to take? And you probably were going to ask me, what are some of these factors? Well, let me tell you. There's been, declining government funding, which has meant a lot of things. It's meant that they now have to rely more on earned revenue, which means they have to think like attractions because they need to attract people who will then spend money at their institutions. The increase in the competitive environment around them, things that Brian's talking about, like the void, entertainment, high-quality entertainment, extremely immersive, popping up in all forms around them, not just regional theme parks. The sort of democratization of technology in homes, where now everyone has, home theater system and video games, incredible amounts of information on the internet. So actually, they don't need to go to museums in the same way that they used to have to. And certainly, it's been talked about a lot, but the rise of the millennial generation has really stumped a lot of museums. These are people who, they don't just want to go to a museum, they don't even just want interactivity or immersive experiences. They want social experiences and community building experiences. So now museums are having to do something completely different from what they've done in the past. And then certainly, the fifth factor, John, is just the young children, the touchscreen technology generations where they touch something and expect it to react. And you see them, from the age of 2, they can work iPhones. So, certainly there's been a lot of tension around this. And museums have really struggled with technology and how to incorporate it. And they all make a point of saying, no, we're not just bringing in technology. Technology is furthering our mission. But there's been a lot of fear around this, frankly. And even fear around doing other kinds of sort of program formats to get sort of the young adult kind of millennial generation. But I think what we've seen in the last few years is finally some acceptance and actually museums starting to really embrace technology and sort of the changes that they need to adapt to.
Oh, good. Very interesting factors. Can you give me some examples? Brian talked about the technology and themed attractions. Has that migrated over to museums at all?
Absolutely, and as you can see here, virtual reality and augmented reality is, actually really hitting the museum world, fairly hard in the last couple of years. Just this morning, I think I read an article about the Carnegie Science Center developing a new exhibit that's sort of like Body Worlds, but now you actually can use virtual reality to kind of go inside the human brain. I'm not sure I'd want to do that, but I think we're seeing it all over. We're seeing it for two things too. One is access. So increasing access to their collections. So the American Museum of Natural History in New York, AMNH, partnered with Google Expeditions, which is a new division of Google, to use Google Cardboard, kind of a fairly low-tech viewer, but to allow students in classrooms just around the world, really, to be able to view, their sort of dino hall, actually, from classrooms in South Dakota. So I think that's very, very interesting. Now, I don't know that that actually helps attendance at the facilities themselves. It actually may end up hurting them in some way. But other kinds of things. The British Museum actually launched its first virtual reality weekend last October, and August, actually. It was a walk through a virtual 4,000 square foot roundhouse, and could engage with objects that they find inside. So there were actually, it was the Bronze Age, which curators hate because it's so difficult to get people really interested in these artifacts and really understand why is an artifact from the Bronze Age interesting. I mean, it's frankly not all that interesting when you're walking through most of these museums. But for the first time, people were really, really engaged in the Bronze Age. Some of the senior visitors actually admitted to feeling very uncomfortable with the technology, where they kind of looked down, they'd see the floor and not see their feet, and found that very disconcerting. But what they did notice is all the younger visitors, without hesitation, just sort of embraced it and had a great experience. And then, Dreams of Dali, which is a very interesting partnership between Disney and Dali. Architects of the Imagination was the name. So after sort of a traditional museum visit at the Dali Museum, you would then put on the Oculus Rift kind of, VR headsets and step into a Dali painting. You can only imagine what that would be like, with kind of multi-sensory environment and soundscapes and all the elements of his work, like elephants and birds and ants. I mean, really fascinating stuff, and we're starting to see it just so pervasive now. And frankly, some institutions that have been very, very slow to change over the years.
Can we talk about, we have a secret national museum client that has developed a technology for walking on another planet? Or can we not talk about that?
Well, you can talk about it if you'd like to.
I don't think I can. But they've developed a virtual augmented reality where you can actually walk on another planet using scientific data that's been discovered. So that's another example, I think.
Right,
Yeah.
and I have lots of examples actually in art museums on the next slide.
Okay.
So things like, in the past when we thought about interactivity and entertainment coming to museums, I mean, frankly, most of your clients, if you've ever worked in the museum world, they've been more science centers, children's museums, technology centers. Now we're starting to see art museums get into technology, things like, the Rain Room, where it's perpetually falling water, you can actually, impact the ability to sort of control rain. You can control rain with your body. And then the Pace Art and Technology Gallery in Menlo Park, which just opened this year, really interesting. 20 immersive digital works in a 20,000 square foot gallery. 8 of them were actually built specifically for kids. So this is completely immersive, you touch things and they change. I've had a lot of friends who've actually gone there and just spent hours and hours there with their kids who actually would not spend hours and hours in a more traditional museum setting, and certainly not an art museum.
So it's not just technology to interpret art. The art actually is technology.
Exactly. So we're seeing the rise of digital arts.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I think what's on the next slide is probably interesting too.
Are these, you say monetization, are these new things that actually make money for museums?
Right, I mean, everyone knows about the maker movement, and certainly this growth spurt we've seen in maker movements, if you think about the last decade. Now a lot of museums would probably, be somewhat cynical and say, we've been doing this all along. Creativity and ingenuity, and certainly people like the Exploratorium are going to say, this is what we've been about since we were founded. But it's interesting to watch the rise of the maker movement because they're almost somewhat sort of mini museums in some ways. You see a lot of common factors. Big corporate sponsors, a lot of them are organized as nonprofit organizations with big corporate sponsorship. State and local government funding, free rent in some cities. Membership-based sort of models, partnerships with universities. A lot of really interesting parallels. And I think with the proliferation of this kind of formal maker movement, we've seen museums start to develop more formal experiences. So certainly most museums have a maker gallery, like Kosai, when we were there, has, 1,000, 2,000 square foot kind of maker space, which is part of the general admission ticket. New York Hall of Science, I think, takes it up a notch and has sort of a larger area with, much more kind of professional equipment and 3D printers and that sort of thing with formalized workshops. Very much attracting, the adult audience, I'll say. And then also, but I think what's really interesting is the Arizona Science Center. They have just opened a 6,500 square foot space called Create. It is ticketed separately from the institution. It's $10 to get in. They have monthly and annual memberships for something like $35 a month and $400 a year. You get access to all the tools, the woodworking, the art supplies, 3D printers, technology. It's almost like you're sort of workshop away from home, and actually it works great in urban areas. So museums are starting to get into this in a real way and really monetize it. So we're going to be watching this for sure. I mean, the other thing it's done is really grant access. You know, science centers, a lot of science centers and children's museums, adults only go there with kids during a certain phase of their life. We're starting to now see adults come back to some of these more kid-oriented institutions.
Yeah, I hear adults are coloring now, so we can integrate that.
Yeah, and I don't know, that, you know, we've talked about that. We're not sure that's really a positive trend.
Right. Is there anything you could tell us about maybe Europe or Asia museums there?
Well, I wanted to mention one more thing,
Oh,
just
sorry.
getting on the
Go ahead.
adults. And the next slide. You know, on this topic of, you know, sort of adult-oriented events, you know, certainly these museums have had these sorts of, you know, Nightlife is a classic example, California Academy of Sciences, where, you know, every week they get, you know, thousands of people who come to basically experience the museum. And I think there's a lot of examples like this. AMNH kind of takes it to the next level with their adult sleepover. Margreet tells me it's all the rage in the dating scene.
Yeah, dating.
In London, that's where you go to have your
Evenings
first
for
date.
the singles
Evenings
at
for
the
the
British
singles.
Museum.
Well, there you go. But what's different now, because I think this has been around for a while, and you're probably rolling your eyes and thinking, why is she telling me this? What's different now is it's actually become a significant part of mainstream attendance. It is a driver of attendance. Before, museums were the first ones to kind of write it off and sort of say, yeah, that's kind of our nod to, you know, attracting young professionals, the millennial generation, but they don't really come back for the real museum experience. Well, it turns out, you know, and I've been to Nightlife several times, you know, people are doing exactly what they would do during the day, but just at night and surrounded by cocktails and DJs and bands. You know, and by the way, research scientists who, you know, while you're having your drink are sort of explaining things to you, and boy, is it interesting after you had your first drink. But, you know, some of these museums, this kind of attendance is accounting for up to 10% of their annual attendance. That is substantial and significant, millions of dollars of earned revenue.
Great. Party on museums.
That's right.
Now, can you talk about Europe and Asia?
Sure, and I'll talk about Europe. You know, so Europe and North America, you know, museum attendance is really sort of driven by things that you would think of. The popularity of new exhibits, external factors like Zika virus or, you know, accidents, and you know, special events. So as a few examples, you know, the Netherlands, and actually I should really have Margreet talk about this since it's her homeland. Go ahead.
All right. Rijksmuseum attendance was down this year, but that's because last year was an absolutely exceptional year after the reopening and the renovation of the building. And if you ever have a chance to go see it, go see it. The Reina Sofia had a really good year again, and that's on the back of a couple of very good exhibitions that have been driving that. The V&A, I understand they won another award for exactly that exhibit that brought them so much attendance, so that's a double whammy for that one exhibit. Well done. Louvre, as usual, not much change in that. I think I would really like to talk about the Auschwitz Museum. They celebrated 70 years of liberation there, and the attendance was just phenomenal, obviously.
And they're a new entrant to our themed index this year, I believe, our museum index.
Well, yes, they've never managed it before, but they're now in there with that phenomenal increase in visitation. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen next year. I would love for them to be in there still, but that may not be the case.
Yeah, we can't pick personal favorites now, can we? Can we move on to Asia?
By all means,
Okay,
it's your
so-
bag, though.
So on the next slide. Okay, so last year I think you might remember me saying, you know, China has this national policy of building 100 museums a year. So in the next 10 years, there's going to be 1,000 museums developed in China. And that's still very much on track. You know, the latest trend, though, is that we're seeing developers in China required actually to sort of plan and build museums and just hand them over to the government. And so that's had a couple interesting results. First of all, we've seen, you know, buildings designed by some of the world's top architects, and certainly very high quality architects, just great buildings with virtually nothing inside them. No collection, no visitor experience, nothing. And this is really starting to become a significant problem for China. And so we see some opportunity here. Similarly, we see a lot of sort of, reinvestment, which is great. We're always big proponents of reinvestment, and also more private museums. Now, unfortunately, in China, they can't be called museums anymore, but they're still museums but they're private. But as better museums enter the market in Asia, we would really expect to see people's expectations change. This may be somewhat negative for some of these smaller museums, but overall, we think it's going to be very positive and actually result in many opportunities for exhibit designers and kind of the themed entertainment industry, as they need to sort of get these things sort of improved and also just filled out. And typical in China, national policy really drives quite a bit. In the past, the national policy for museums was that their first priority was really on collections, then research, and last education. Well, there's now been sort of a very top-level government mandate saying education has to be first. And that, I think, is tremendous news for our industry. Education will push what sort of the China term is kind of the software, or the collection, or the visitor experience, the exhibits inside the museums. And so the museums are not going to be able to just show collections and sort of have objects and with very limited kind of interpretation, but are really going to have to be more audience-oriented. And this kind of expertise is still very, very limited in China. Now, certainly, opportunities in China are great, and it's sometimes hard to translate those to actual business, opportunities. But we do think that over time this will continue to be just a fantastic, chance for some of our members here to really get involved in China.
Great, fantastic. Well, thanks, Linda.
Thank you, John.
Well, reporting live from Disneyland in California, this is John Robinett.
And Linda Cheu.
And this is World Attraction News. Thank you, Linda. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we actually have 7 minutes and 37 seconds left for questions. Oh, we got one in the back.
Good morning. I wasn't sure if I just missed it, or did you mention activities and developments in the Middle East?
No, you did not miss anything, and no, I did not mention them. I think we're all waiting for them, to be honest. We're very much waiting for them to open their doors and see how they'll perform. It's been an oft-asked question, I must admit. But until they open, it's very hard to predict what they're actually going to do. They're breaking the mold in Dubai by the amount of parks that are due to open in a very short period of time. And there's very little evidence for us to base ourselves on to look at how they might perform. So no, you didn't miss anything. I just evaded it. Thanks.
Thank you, Margreet. Anyone else?
Dubai is a bubble in the Middle East, but there's a lifting of sanctions in Iran, who has a huge level of cultural and intellectual history. Do you have any speculations on if the lifting of sanctions and the opening up of Iran was successful, how would that impact this industry?
I'd love for that to happen. I don't know is the honest answer. I'm not quite sure how long it's going to take to get them there. I hope that the first thing we'll see is developments on the museum side, on the cultural attraction side, more than anything else. And I would like to hope that that falls in line with our cultural heritage. So whether that is going to be a spate of interpretation centers around their cultural heritage, or whether that is musea based on the vast collections that they have, I'm not quite sure. I think it'll take a lot longer than 5 years to actually see a theme park. If we're looking at themed entertainment, then I believe that's going to take much longer. We need a bit more stability, and we need a bit more trust from developers into that. Having said that, I could be proven wrong, very simply because a lot of developers in the Middle East are at the moment looking at themed entertainment as a component of a large mixed-use development. And they're hoping that that will catapult some activity or buzz into the development. So at some point in time, somebody may just take a huge leap of faith and do that well before we would otherwise expect to see it happen in Western Europe. Go ahead, yeah.
What about Dubai's big on medical tourism, but that's true around the world. What do you
Well, we've actually been doing a number of studies, primarily in North America. Margreet can tell me if you've done them in Europe, around medical tourism, developing large medical complexes which have facilities that can that are suitable for the families that come and visit. For example, sick relatives, so they have hotels, they have retail, and they also want to have cultural and entertainment uses. So we've been working with the Mayo Clinic for some time to develop that, and in several other places. In Pennsylvania, we're working on a big medical master plan. So I think this industry should probably look at that as a bit of a peripheral, but maybe a potential client base as these medical complexes develop.
I'm not quite sure we've developed an IP for that quite yet. Having said that, yes, medical tourism is something that everyone's interested in. I still have to get my head around how that combines with general tourism. I find in a lot of destinations in Europe and the Middle East, there is a wish for developers to combine, let's call it general tourism, with medical tourism. And that combination is still hard to see. We find that people are willing to travel for medical tourism when we're talking about elective medical procedures. Cosmetic, yes. Yeah. And there is this feeling that if you're on a, let's call it normal holiday, and you walk into someone who's got a bandaged face and 2 black eyes, that may not be the most interesting thing to see, and that may not entice you to spend a lot in your RD&E. So I think there are some factors within that we still, as an industry, have to resolve. And yes, we need an IP for it, really, don't we?
But there are a lot of specialty tourism categories, right? I mean, there's yoga tourism, there's adventure tourism, there's a lot of niches in the tourist market, which this industry could probably develop products for, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the way we start to combine some of the active leisure as well within that and create a new whole is definitely something I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm seeing that in Europe as a combination with retail,
right,
where retail is combining with all kinds of active leisure elements and themed entertainment elements, and creating a leisure destination that happens to incorporate shopping, because shopping, physical shopping, is turning into leisure more than anything else. Anything we have to buy, after all, we can buy online.
Right. I wanted to just say something else about Iran, which I thought was a very interesting question. Back in the Shah's era, which I'm dating myself, we actually did some studies for the development of theme parks there, and they have very large markets. So they have the bodies. The income levels aren't great, so you have to sort of income qualify the market. But I think even after doing that, assuming things get better for them once the sanctions are withdrawn, they probably have the disposable income and the bodies to generate enough market demand. But I think, and a lot of the attractions in the Middle East are indoor FECs. So I think those sort of attractions might work. In terms of the outdoor theme parks and some of those, there might be some cultural barriers that we might have to think about, just like in Saudi Arabia, where they have a strict form of Islam. There's barriers to certain types of activities, and I think we have to see how that would go in Iran. Okay, anyone else?
I think we're out of time.
Yes, we're out of time. We're clicking down. Well, thank you, everybody.